Greetings and welcome to another edition of the Pedalshift Project. The Pedalshift Project is a series of conversations, thoughts, and experiments around the bike touring lifestyle. From tips and tricks to ideas on how to ride your ride, let's shrink the world by bike. Show notes and more are available at pedalshift.net/272, and you can email the show at pedalshift@pedalshift.net or text me at 202-930-1109 and check Pedalshift out on all the socials as well. Hello everybody and welcome to the 272nd edition of the Pedalshift Project. My name's Timuni. Thanks so much for joining. Really excited. We're jumping in again to the continuation of our remote route scouting series. On this edition, this is a fun one. We're going to be talking about a ride that is a portion of a larger one, and it would be going from Dayton, Ohio to St. Louis, Missouri. And this particular route goes back to the before times. When in the past, I've talked on the show, I've ridden a lot of pieces of the country, and I realized, I would say sometime in the middle of COVID, maybe even before COVID, that I could piece together a cross-country ride in segments just based on what I've done over the last 10 years or so. Well, less than that, actually, quite frankly. And I am kind of intrigued with doing that, and that's why I'm going to revisit this particular route. In 2019, I did the DC to Cincinnati ride. And of course, I've been reminded of that because we've been doing the best ofs over the last couple of months, and we've got at least another episode or two in the best ofs to cover that trip. The year prior to that, in 2018, I rode from Kansas City to St. Louis via the Katy Trail. So if you kind of connect all of these things up, there's a gap in there between the St. Louis area and the Katy Trail, and where I was somewhere on the Ohio to Erie Trail, I passed through Xenia, Ohio, which is very, very close to Dayton. So that gap in between from roughly Dayton, Ohio to St. Louis, Missouri, gives me a contiguous ride from DC to Kansas City minus one small potential amount. And I'll talk about that in a moment, but it leaves a really interesting segment or two to get to the West Coast. It's actually more than that. It's several segments more that I would have to do. But in any event, I think that the idea of at least connecting those dots and having the very, very close to contiguous ride between DC and Kansas City is just a very compelling reason in and of itself, regardless of whether or not I end up having a plan to do the full cross-country in segments ride. So let's talk a little bit about the route and the different potential options that are there. And then I'm going to go back to talk about that one little bitty part that I think that I would need to, if I wanted to be a completist, do in Ohio. But we'll get to that in a moment. So let's start with the route. The route I think I'm looking at is utilizing the Eastern Express. And if you're not familiar with the Eastern Express, I did an interview back on Pedalshift Project's number 79, way back in the day with Frank Moritz. And he basically built this brand new route that has since been adopted by the Adventure Cycling Association as an alternative for the eastern portion of the Trans Am route. The reason being is that if there are complaints about the Trans Am, and this is not universal, but to the extent that people say, you know what I could have done without? Kentucky. And also some of the very hilly parts in Missouri as well. And so what Frank did was and you can listen to the show, and I really encourage you to take a listen to it, came up with a route that utilized a lot of the existing trails, rail trails and otherwise. It sort of bypasses a lot of this. Now, it goes through completely different sections of the country compared to the Trans Am, but obviously it gets from point A to point B. Now, the Trans Am, as you probably are aware of, starts off in, where does it start off in? It starts off in sort of the Williamsburg area of Virginia. I'm sure it's a different part, but somewhere in that area. The Eastern Express starts in DC proper. Now, of course, you can ride up to DC from that area if you want to be a completist and do the Trans Am that way. I think that that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. In the Triple Crown of hiking, the idea is that there is a route, but you are allowed to deviate so long as you walk every mile. And if you take the Eastern Express, it's just an alternate Trans Am route. So I think that it's a really interesting project to begin with. And I think because of Frank's relationship with the ACA, he had done a lot of work with them over time. It's no wonder that the ACA ended up adopting this, and they started riding it, I believe, back starting in 2019. They started doing some of their guided tours using the Eastern Express. So it's pretty integrated into their system now. So what are the pros to using a route like the Eastern Express? I mean, first and foremost, it's scouted. It has great cue sheets, and I've got a link in the show notes to the website. Now, I'm not sure if that website is going to exist for much longer. According to it, Frank's going to be taking that down, and I think it will be absorbed into the ACA. Which means that if you do want this route, I would imagine at some point that they're going to start to monetize that and start selling their versions of the maps on it. So if you do want the free cue sheets and the free route, I would definitely recommend that you go there right now. I do believe that when the ACA does eventually take this over, should they be doing the maps and everything, they're going to sprinkle their pixie dust on it and do all the great add-ons that they do that makes purchasing their stuff, I think, worth it if you would like a paper map or an online map of it. But for the moment, it's all free and it's all there. Cons, I do have to say it's not the most exciting route in the world that's out there. It focuses on flat and low traffic routes. For me, this would be the reason to do this is the connections here, not because I'm going to be going through these amazing sections of the country with beautiful views and whatnot. It really would be potentially in parts a lot of head down, just get to the next day kind of a thing. But frankly, I do a lot of that kind of touring anyways, or at least I have in the past. So it is kind of interesting. The other con, of course, is that this would be almost entirely on road routes, which may or may not necessarily be the type of thing that I would be after. Now, we talked about it last time, that it would be I think almost entirely road route for the Texas trip. This also would be a lot of road route as well. So, the question ends up being, is this the best way to do it? There are other opportunities for alternative routes to the Eastern Express. I did plug in roughly the cities involved here, and Google Maps ended up having a different route compared to what Frank did. And to be honest, I would spend a lot of time in Google Earth and in Google Street View if I were to deviate. The biggest reason why Frank's route was so incredibly important was he has had a lot of experience scouting roads. I think that he may have made choices that are different than maybe what I would have done in certain circumstances. I think that it strikes me that his intention was to go to low traffic routes and with a few other factors involved in there. I don't mind a little bit of traffic if it's on roads like certain U.S. highways where there's a good solid shoulder involved. And many, if not most U.S. highways, once they're outside of kind of more urban areas and even suburban areas, it depends on the area that you're in, you often will end up with a really wide shoulder and a straight shot to the direction that you're going. So I may consider looking, if I do end up choosing this route or wanting to dig even further in than I've done already, taking a look at Google Maps, seeing what it suggests. And I do believe that it does recommend going on some U.S. highways to see what those look like in comparison to what Frank's Eastern Express is. Because I think that if they don't replace the Eastern Express as my option, I think that there's a really strong chance that it would be an opportunity to maybe fast forward a little bit, maybe have some better riding through certain parts of the route. So I'm looking at some combination of the Eastern Express with some other recommended routes as well, just because I think that it's worth taking a look at. But I think that the backbone of this would be utilizing that Eastern Express route. So let's talk a little bit about logistics for this whole thing. Now, obviously, I do not live in Dayton, Ohio. I do not live in St. Louis, Missouri. So in one way, shape, or form, I'm going to need to end up making a decision as to where I would go. I have leaned more towards doing the start in Dayton rather than in St. Louis. I don't think it really matters all that much, but I do think that for whatever reason, I like the idea of going east to west on this for maybe arbitrary reasons, but I think that's what I've been leaning to. There are direct flights to Dayton from my preferred airport in the DC area, which is a national airport, DCA airport. I can ride there if I'd like. It's the closest to where I live. There are all sorts of good reasons for it. But by the way, for those of you who are thinking about flying into DC, you do have three options. Of course, you get DCA, you got BWI, and you've got IAD, which is Dulles Airport. The closest to DC proper is, even though it's on the other side of the river, is DCA. The cheapest can often be BWI, but you do have options to get into DC from all of those. The reason why DCA can often be the most convenient, however, is it is where many members of Congress fly in and out of. So, because of a variety of pressures that are involved in all of those things, and I'll leave it at that, there are tons of direct flights to all sorts of points all around the country out of DCA airport. Just for convenience, it's a pretty good deal. It used to be back in the day that it was by far the most expensive of all the airports. That has changed through the years. So I always end up looking there first and looking for direct flights when they are available. DCA happens to have some direct flights to Dayton. They also, I haven't really looked all that carefully, but I'm quite certain that Lambert Airport, which is St. Louis's airport, would fly direct to DCA as well. So should I choose what I think is the most likely option where I would go east to west, flying into Dayton, there is a very short ride to go from Dayton to Xenia, Ohio, where I could tag the Ohio to Erie Trail, and then I would immediately turn west. It's only, I think it's maybe 10 to 15 miles. It really would not be a lot of mileage to do that and get that tag with the Ohio to Erie Trail where I have had wheels down. So then turning west and taking whatever route would be possible. I would have, from a logistics perspective, an emphasis on camping. And I think based on the limited amount of look-sees at the Eastern Express route, I think that there would be an emphasis, well, maybe not an emphasis, but I would probably take advantage of stealth camping whenever possible. This is the challenge that I have found whenever I have looked at cross-country routes. I have found that in larger swaths of the country, the camping opportunities, or at least the kind of paid camping opportunities, look kind of so-so. Now, I do know that many folks on the Transamerica route will very quickly dispense with, I've got to camp in a campsite, and will often end up in a lot of small towns, municipal parks, because they do allow camping. They'll end up in a lot of churches because many churches will allow camping in the Midwest and into the West. And so that there's a lot of opportunities. I do think that stealth camping would be another layer that would be available to me. What I don't really want to get into too much, and this is just because I'm such a loner when it comes to cycling. Yes, I talk into microphones and talk like I talk to lots of people all the time, every day. I seem like a lot of an extrovert, but I'm much more introverted when I'm cycling. Having to ask people, hey, do you mind if I camp in your yard, doesn't strike me as the type of thing that I'll want to do. So I think that I'm going to exercise some of my stealth camping capabilities. I've noticed that the Eastern Express route goes through some towns with roofed lodging, but not a ton, and they may not be timed very well for when I would need to be stopping. So I would certainly take advantage of that as necessary, but I think I would do that in a more limited capacity than I would ordinarily. From a logistics perspective with the bicycle, I would almost assuredly use my full-size bike and go fully loaded for a trip like this. I think anytime that you're really covering tons and tons of miles, I like the capability of having all of the tools that are necessary. I do think that I would have to carry, because of my potential for stealth camping, I think I would be carrying some more stealthy components, things to cover up the bike. I've got some brown tarps that I think are useful. I have a brown tarp with a green on the other side. It would depend on the time of year. Spring, it depends. If I would go in early spring, there might not be as much leaf coverage, so stealth camping might not be as good. So we'll just have to see with that, but definitely fully loaded, giving me the opportunity to basically sleep any place that I want to, have the tools to cook, the stove, all of those types of things. I think that would be a really necessary part of all this. But, as I do roll through towns where there is food available, I would probably try to not carry too terribly much food with me. I have learned through the years that I am better off if I carry maybe like kind of calling it an emergency meal, but having a meal or two with me, but focusing more on just kind of heavy snacks for when I carry for when I roll, because I do tend to find that, I will tend to eat in towns as I go along, for a trip like this. But you never want to be stuck with a point where it's like, okay, it's the end of the day and I'd like to stop and oops, there's no town nearby, but there's great stealth camping here. I guess I don't eat. Yeah, that's not going to happen. So I'll always make sure that I've got some kind of meal available for me. And that, of course, means that, stopping and making sure that I can do resupplies at grocery stores as I go along is always a really good idea. I think that that's something that I tend to do the most often in longer rides, things that are at least a week or more. So I'll definitely be taking advantage of that. As I mentioned, I'm going to be relying from a camping perspective on the excellent work done by Frank Moritz, and another shout out to Pedalshift number 79 to listen to the interview that I did with him and all of the work and all of the fantastic things that he did. By the way, this also was written by a lot of people subsequently, not just the ACA folks, but a lot of folks gave him tons of information on tweaks to what his original Eastern Express was. It is not exactly the same as it was when he started. So tons of great information in there. I've gone through the cue sheets before. I found some of the camping opportunities, as I mentioned earlier, to be only so-so. So as a result, I guess it's kind of reiterating what I said before, I'm almost assuredly going to mix in some stealth camping. One of the things that I wanted to say as an aside here is I've had some really good luck with existing municipal parks that don't necessarily allow camping in it, that have wooded fringes between it and something next door. And I'll use the example that I used when I did the Ohio to Erie Trail back in 2019, the one stealth camping opportunity that I had that I really enjoyed, and I needed to stop there. I had no way that I could go any further because of the headwinds that day. And I was looking around and trying to find spots that would be favorable for it. There was a municipal park, and it ended up having a wooded fringe between it and I believe it was the high school, and also a cemetery that was nearby as well. And so I found a fantastic spot that was sort of in between all three of them. It was sort of at this weird junction there, and it ended up being a really fantastic spot. And I think that as I've kind of done my keeping my eyes open for stealth camping opportunities, just, when I'm looking around, not necessarily doing it, but like kind of scouting it out as I've been riding along, or even just kind of rolling around in a car. I always like to say, oh, that's a good stealth camping opportunity. I found those wooded fringes to be a really interesting place because they are a buffer between two properties. They tend to be a good place, I think, and that might be something that I would keep an eye open for. There seems to be a lot of options for that. potentially on this route. I would probably try to find my way to some roofed lodging at some points, but try to keep it to a minimum just because obviously that ups your budget quite a bit. But in the end, if I was going east to west, I would probably try to find my way to a St. Louis area hotel that would hopefully have a shuttle to the airport. So that would mean getting to, I think it's the north side of St. Louis, if memory serves, where Lambert Airport is. So to try to find my way to that direction to end up there. I would ideally like to do the same thing on the western end and tag those suburbs where the Katy Trail is. That might add an extra day or so to all of these things. I think that ultimately, what I'll just have to end up kind of making peace with things when all is said and done. You could make an argument that for a true cross-country segmented trip that you really want to kind of like get to a point where you're putting tire on tire for all of these routes. I don't know if I would end up doing that in St. Louis. It is a little tricky to bike in that area. I obviously did it before. When I ended up going to the train as the ending point in, I believe it was Kirkwood, Missouri. So, and this gets to the point that I was talking about at the top of the show. I technically did not get full, wheels down specifically from the Gap and the post-Gap ride, which was highlighted this past week on the Best Of, to the Ohio to Erie Trail. You'll note that I ended up going to Kent, Ohio, and taking the bus up to Cleveland. And the reason why I did that is because I wanted to do the whole length of the Ohio to Erie Trail. Kent, Ohio is, I think, not very far from the Ohio to Erie Trail. But what I didn't want to do was I didn't want to take the extra days to ride from Kent to the Ohio to Erie Trail, go all the way up to Cleveland, then all the way back down cycling. I just didn't have that many days in my schedule. So ultimately, you could argue that I'm missing 5 to 10 miles or however long it is from Kent to wherever the closest access to the Ohio to Erie Trail is. Is that a big deal? Probably not. Does that mean that I can kind of fudge it on the St. Louis side as well? Yeah, probably. I don't know. I keep talking about, and I'll be talking about actually next week, I believe, about kind of missing links and things like that. Sometimes it bothers me and sometimes it doesn't. So, I'll have to kind of figure it all out if it matters that much, whether I'm going to have to ride at some point those extra miles in between Kent, Ohio and the Ohio to Erie Trail, and whether I would feel the need to connect the dots over on the St. Louis side to get at least to Kirkwood. I'm not sure exactly how that would all work out, but that is part of the assessment for all of this and part of the logistics of all of this. But I do think that no matter what, on the St. Louis side, I would have a hotel at the end of that ride, just because it's always a lot easier, I have found, when you are fully loaded with the full-size touring bike, to be able to have a hotel night, because then I can get things packed up. I do have to disassemble the bike to a certain degree to get into that bike bag. I certainly was able to do that without too much of a hassle when I was in Medford, Oregon, in 2021, when I finished the Oregon Coast ride and did that fast forward to the to Medford via bus, and then I rode to the airport. That worked out fine. It didn't take me very long to do. So do I need to? I would argue yes, just because I get an extra shower at the end of all of that. For the Oregon ride, I was able to have a shower in camp, and I did very minimal riding in Medford, even though it was very warm. I was not a disaster on the plane going to Seattle that night, and I ended up having a hotel in Seattle after all said and done there. I do like to try to make sure that my fellow passengers do not think that I am some dirtbag bike tourist, even though, frankly, I kind of am. Okay, let's talk about the time of year. Spring seems to be a really good bet, which is why we're talking about this as part of the potential routes for a spring tour. Summer, this is just going to be muggy, hot, and frankly, very exposed to a lot of sunshine while you're on some of these roads. So I am definitely not considering this to be a summer tour, definitely looking at this as a spring thing. If I don't choose this for this spring, potentially a future spring. Fall, I think, would be also a possibility as well, though I haven't done a ton of research on the weather in these areas. I do think that it would certainly work, but I did the Katy Trail in May, and frankly, it was hot, and not too deep into May either. So I do think that an earlier spring thing would be good for this one. As I mentioned, this gets me a quasi-contiguous segment between DC and Kansas City when this is all all said and done. So where does that leave me for the possibility of a segmented cross-country trip after that? Well, as best as I can tell, there's probably about 3 additional segments. Now, I could conceivably collapse a couple of these together into some longer riding, but I think that the next potential obvious ride would be a Kansas City to Fort Collins or vice versa ride. That's Fort Collins, Colorado, and then Fort Collins to Boise as another potential segment, and then Boise to Portland, I think would be the kind of obvious thing. The interesting thing about these segments is that it would start to follow, I believe, the Lewis and Clark route to a certain extent, which would be kind of nice. Also, some of the Trans Am, I think, but these segments would be a little bit more of tried and true routes, I think, except for the Boise to Portland route. That would be a little roll your own kind of a thing. But in any event, if this does end up becoming my choice for the spring tour, I think that those segments look really, really intriguing for some later tours as well. Of course, we do get into the challenge of the 2020s and climate change and fire season and things like that. So that would certainly have to be something that I'd be looking at, but not for now, because those are not being looked at as part of this year kind of a thing, except maybe if I do choose this Dayton to St. Louis ride, maybe I would choose one of those other segments for later in the year. So I guess we'd have to kind of figure that all out, but certainly none of them in the summer. So in any event, I have to say I am intrigued as heck about this ride. I really like that it is a continuation of work that I've already done, which I think is kind of fun and cool. I also like the fact that this is something that isn't something I've done before, which is certainly a part of the goals that I've had. It's also something that I think is maybe not ridden as frequently, which is another interesting and compelling aspect of this ride. It looks like it's been scouted to be safe and good, but not necessarily something where it's kind of... There's a lot of folks who have ridden it before, so I like that element too. Well, in any event, I'm going to be continuing to look at other rides as we go forward. I'm grateful for all of you to be along with me for the ride, for this route scouting. Coming next week, we're going to be concluding our route scouting segment here. And we're going to be doing a little bit of a dealer's choice, if as it were. There were a lot of other routes that I thought were kind of interesting, but they're a little bit on the shorter side. So if I end up doing a shorter spring tour, I wanted to kind of have at least 3. I'm going to be covering at least 3 next week. Shorter tours and honorable mentions. These are going to be trips that I am definitely going to be considering for a shorter tour, and then an honorable mentions one because I've been getting a lot of recommendations from folks via social media and whatnot. So I wanted to make sure that I at least mention some of them as well. That's coming next week on the Pedalshift Project. One last thing really important for all of you Jason Kent fans. Jason's got a brand new single which is coming out in advance of Sunfield's new album, which is coming out this spring. It's called Something More. It's really, really good. And I've got a link in the show notes so you can go check it out wherever cool music is available. And as always, we like to close out the show with a special shout out to the Pedalshift Society. Because of support from listeners like you, Pedalshift is a weekly bicycle touring podcast with a global community, expanding into live shows and covering new tours like this fall's upcoming bike tour. If you like what you hear, you can support the show for $5, $2, or even $1 a month. And there's one-shot and annual options if you're not into the small monthly thing. Check it all out at pedalshift.net/society. On to the society. Kimberly Wilson, Caleb Jenkinson, Cameron Lean, Andrew McGregor, Michael Hart, Keith Nagel, Brock Dittus, Thomas Skadow, Marco Lowe, Terrence Manson, Harry Telgadas, Chris Barron, Mark Van Rank, Brad Hipwell, Mr. T, Nathan Poulton, Stephen Dickerson, Vince LaGreco, Cody Florchinger, Tom Beninati, Greg Braithwaite, Sandy Pizzio, Jeff Muster, Seth Pollock, Joseph Quinn, Drew Porter, Byron Patterson, Joachim Robber, Ray Jackson, Jeff Fry, Kenny Mikey, Lisa Hart, John Denkler, Steve Henkel, Miguel Quinones, Alejandro Aviles Reyes, Keith Spangler, Greg Towner, Jody Zaranin, Lucas Barwick, Michael Baker, Brian Bechtal, Reinhard Bigel, Greg Middlemas, Connie Moore, William Gothman, Brian Benton, Joan Churchill, Mike Bender, Rick Weinberg, Billy Crafton, Gary Matushak, Greg Latoile Lopez, James Sloan, Jonathan Dillard, John Funk, Ronald Paroli, Dave Roll, Brian Hafner, Misha LeBon, Ari Messenger, David Gropke, Todd Grossbeck, Wally Estrella, Sue Reinert, John Lico, Stephen Granada, Philip Mueller, Robert Lackey, Dominic Carroll, Jackie McCullough, John Hickman, Carl Presseau, David Neves, Patty Louise, Terry Fitzgerald, Peter Steinmetz, Timothy Fitzpatrick, Michael Azuski, Hank O'Donnell, David Zanoni, David Weil, Matthew Sponseller, Chad Reno, Spartan Dale, Carolyn Ferguson, Peggy Littlefield, Lauren Allensmith, Eric Burns, Thomas Pearl, Darren McKibben, Richard Stewart, Dave Fletcher, Jack Smith, Luke Parkinson, and new to the Society, Ryan Patterson. And thanks also to all past and anonymous folks for helping make this show happen. Thank you for joining. You can find Pedalshift at pedalshift.net for more great bicycle touring content. You can hear the Pedalshift Project through Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. Opening music courtesy of Jason Kent off his self-titled album. The track is called America. Check out his band Sunfield's latest release, Mono Mono, wherever cool music is available.